All right, carbohydrates week 4, ladies and gentlemen. This is one of my more favourite topics to speak on because it's certainly a hot topic at the moment, carbohydrates and the role that it plays in our everyday diets. What you need to appreciate from the get-go is the big picture, which is essentially humans have existed for about 6 million years, and with what they call the modern form of human, about 200,000 years. So despite the length of time that we've actually existed, there's something dramatically happening with regard to our health in more recent times. So as you are all aware, we're witnessing an explosion in obesity rates and a whole bunch of associated health disorders worldwide. So if you try and get your head around this, if we condensed all of human existence into the past 24 hours, then we've only really engaged in what we call large-scale agricultural practices in the last 4 minutes. So we've been growing grains, etc., just for the last 4 minutes. And our 20 times increase in sugar consumption has only occurred in the past 5 seconds. So, in other words, we have dramatically changed our dietary habits very, very recently in relation to all of human existence. And you could argue, as a result, we're witnessing an explosion in obesity. Now, if you turn back the clock to the 1960s, there was only 1 in 8 people who were obese. And now, as you probably are aware, it's now 1 in 3. So what have we done over the last 30, 40 years that may explain this explosion in obesity and chronic health conditions such as type 2 diabetes? Now, because there's considerable controversy surrounding the role of carbohydrates in our diet, I've decided to divide this lecture in half. So the first half, it'll provide you with what we call a traditional view of carbohydrates, i.e. That they should comprise the majority of our dietary energy needs. The second half of the lecture will provide you with what I'm calling an alternate view. It's a very basic overview of how and why our understanding of carbohydrates may actually be wrong. So the lecture is obviously designed to provide you some food for thought, no pun intended, because I've got a responsibility, as I've mentioned previously, to develop in you what we call this critical habit of mind. I know I keep banging on about it, but it's to ensure that you don't just receive a one-sided view of these topics that we go through. All right, so let's kick off. The term carbohydrate literally means hydrated carbon. So anything that's hydrated obviously contains water. Thus, the carbon is joined by what we call hydrogen and oxygen. So we ingest the majority of carbohydrates from plant sources, so fruits and vegetables and grains, etc. And this is basic level science that you probably did early high school. Plants make glucose through what we call photosynthesis, and it's during photosynthesis the green pigment in plants known as chlorophyll absorbs sunlight, which provides the energy needed to manufacture glucose. So in this picture you can see the water is absorbed from the earth via the root systems, combines with carbon dioxide present in the leaves to produce glucose, which remains in the plant until we walk along as humans, pull it out of the ground and eat it as a carbohydrate source. There's 2 types of carbohydrates, and years ago they used to be referred to as simple and complex. They're not necessarily referred to as simple and complex these days, just carbohydrates, but for ease of explanation of what the different forms of carbohydrates, I'm still going to use these terms simple and complex. Simple are often referred to as sugars, as you can see on the screen, and there's 3 of these sugars are known as what we call monosaccharides, mono meaning 1, a single sugar molecule, and these in the examples I've given you, glucose, fructose and galactose. Now each monosaccharide contains 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms and 6 oxygen atoms. So as you can see at the top right hand side, C6H12O6 is the chemical composition of carbohydrates. And there's some slight variations in the structure of these monosaccharides, and the slight variation in their structure significantly influences their sweetness. So fructose, for argument's sake, that's the sweet natural sugar you find in fruit and vegetables. Galactose doesn't occur freely in nature. It usually joins with glucose to form what we call lactose. Disaccharides don't have to be Einstein to work out. Essentially means two molecules of sugar joined together. So as you can see, maltose is comprised of 2 glucose. Lactose is 1 glucose and 1 galactose. And sucrose is 1 glucose and 1 fructose. So what you think of as just standard sugar, table sugar, that white stuff that sits in the middle of the table that you probably put in your tea and coffee and other things, that is what we call sucrose. It's a disaccharide, table sugar. And it's interesting to note, and you're going to need to pay attention to this for later on in the lecture so it makes sense. As soon as you consume sucrose, so let's say you just had a tablespoon of sugar, as soon as it hits the gut will separate sucrose into glucose and fructose. And that has some important implications in terms of how we metabolize carbohydrates, which will make more sense as we go along. Complex carbohydrates are long chains of glucose molecules and are generally referred to as starches as well as glycogen. So, what's the difference between a starch and a glycogen? Well, starch is the stored form of carbohydrate in plants, whereas glycogen is the stored form of carbohydrate in animals. And we get obviously the majority of our complex carbohydrates from starch sources, so from plants, the amount of carbohydrates stored in plant sources. Now, starches exist in 2 structural forms, as you can see on the screen. Amylose is a long, straight chain of glucose molecules twisted or coiled, whereas amylopectin, the diagram with the apple, amylopectin is what we call highly branched, and the structure influences digestibility. So the number of branches that exist with the amylopectin, for example, increases the surface area over which enzymes can break down the starch, hence making it more easily digested than amylose. So this slide just shows you what I've just covered, the 2 structural forms of starch, which remember is the stored form of carbohydrate from plant sources, glycogen, and then there is a 3rd form which is known as fiber, and you've all heard of fiber before. Fiber is kind of the forgotten member of the whole carbohydrate team. So it's only in the past 15 years or so that fiber has actually increased importance in our daily diets. Fiber is a long chain polysaccharide and comes exclusively from plant structures such as leaves and stems and roots and seeds, etc. And it's not digested by the body, so it passes through the digestive system without being digested and absorbed. So fiber doesn't actually contribute any energy to our diets. And the typical Western diet, as you can see on the screen, has little fiber because of the amount of what we call refined foods, so foods that are highly processed, whereas less developed countries rely on plant sources that contain far more fiber. So as we learnt, I think in week 1, week 2, there's 2 forms of fiber based on their chemical and their physical properties. So soluble fiber obviously dissolves in water, that makes sense, forms a gel when it becomes wet, and they're essentially found in citrus fruits and berries and oats and beans, etc. And insoluble obviously doesn't dissolve in water, and it's generally found in whole grains such as wheat and brown rice. And there's some evidence out there to suggest that insoluble fibers are associated with lowering blood cholesterol, if you believe that lowering your cholesterol is something that is beneficial for heart health. All right, because glucose stores are limited, the body will call upon alternate stores such as protein to produce glucose, and that's through a process called gluconeogenesis. So gluconeogenesis is the production of glucose from a non-carbohydrate source, and we know that the smallest unit, or we should know that the smallest unit of proteins are amino acids. We looked at that last week, and there's a particular type of amino acid known as alanine, and it can be converted to glucose in the liver. And there's a slide detailing that in a little bit more detail. And that's called the glucose-alanine cycle. So carbohydrates, and this is the traditional view of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the preferred source of energy for the brain, the central nervous system, red blood cells, particularly during rest. And it's interesting that carbohydrate only provides the rest of the body's needs during rest with about 15 to 20% of energy. So the major energy source for the rest of the body during rest is actually fats. And this is what some theorists argue is a conservation mechanism to ensure we've actually got adequate supplies of carbohydrates available when we start to jump up and start moving around. Okay, when we do start moving around, what happens? Well, the predominant type of energy source used is glycogen, and after exercising and you know this yourself, after exercising at a low to moderate level for greater than about 2 minutes, the body will start to use fats as a fuel source to preserve glycogen stores, and because the breakdown of fats to supply energy can keep pace with our energy demands. But as soon as you start exercising at a higher intensity, our reliance on glycogen also increases. So glycogen as a fuel source is about twice as efficient as fats and proteins. And as muscle glycogen decreases, the liver releases more glycogen along the way, and this process is essentially mediated via our blood glucose level. So as you can see on the screen, after about 1 hour of what we call high intensity exercise, about 50% of our liver glycogen is depleted. And about 2 hours of very high intensity, we've essentially worked all the way through our glycogen stores from our liver. Now, the theory is that trained muscle oxidizes carbohydrate better than untrained muscle, and there is some evidence of that to support that statement. And as I've just said, during what we call submaximal exercise, trained muscle has a decreased reliance on glycogen and a greater use of calling on fat as an energy source. And so you talk about this training adaptation where your body becomes far more efficient at conserving glycogen stores and relying on fat. Now, you've all heard of blood glucose level, and there's essentially two hormones that you should get your head around. The first one you've definitely heard of. You know that once we consume a meal, our blood glucose level increases, and we subsequently have more glucose floating around in our bloodstream than we want, and it needs to find a home, but it can't necessarily find a home in the cells because of its size. So the pancreas releases a hormone called insulin, which acts on as essentially like a set of keys to unlock the cell walls and allows that glucose to enter the cells. So it's gone from the blood into the cells. Insulin also acts on the liver and the muscles to take up glucose and essentially store it as glycogen. Now, the opposite occurs during periods of what we call relative starvation, so 10, 12 hours or more overnight between meals. Our blood glucose level drops, so the pancreas releases glucagon, which acts in opposition to insulin. Glucagon essentially stimulates the liver to convert glycogen to glucose, so it takes that stored form of carbohydrate and releases it in the form of glucose back into the bloodstream, so it can then essentially go around the body and be used as an energy source. And glucagon also helps break down proteins to amino acids so that the liver can engage in that process that we've covered before called gluconeogenesis. Now, speaking of gluconeogenesis, one of the essential functions of carbohydrates is obviously to provide sufficient energy to the brain and the central nervous system. So to protect against suffering depleted stores of glycogen, the theory is that the body has a way of converting these non-carbohydrate sources into glucose. The only problem is it's not an overly efficient process. So proteins can be broken down to amino acids such as alanine, which can then be converted to glucose by the liver. And two byproducts of carbohydrate metabolism, namely lactic acid and pyruvate, can also be converted back to glucose and returned to the muscles as an energy source. All right, another concept you've probably heard of before is what we call the glycemic index. The GI, the glycemic index, refers to the potential of foods to raise blood glucose levels, and it uses this ranking system relative to the effect that consumption of 50 grams of carbohydrates has upon blood glucose over a 2-hour period. So the normal baseline measure is 50 grams of glucose, and then the resultant blood glucose response is scored out of 100. The ranking out of 100 generally refers to the GI quality of the food. So the higher the index score, the more rapidly blood glucose will actually rise. And as you can see here, the general cutoff points are 70 or more. A score of 70 or more is considered high GI. 55, 69 is medium, and less than 55 is considered low GI. So the type of carbohydrate, whether you're consuming a polysaccharide, disaccharide or monosaccharide, the way the carbohydrate is actually prepared, its fat and its fiber content all influence how quickly carbohydrate will actually be digested. And there's some claims, some people have made some claims based on this glycemic index. So the claims are that if you eat a diet that has got low foods, carbohydrates that are considered low GI, then you lower your risk of a whole bunch of chronic health conditions. The evidence is relatively equivocal on this. There's some evidence to suggest that in support of these claims, and there's evidence against these claims as well. Now that's glycemic index. What you probably haven't heard of before is what we call glycemic load. So we know blood glucose level is affected by glycemic index, but what happens if you eat a lot of a particular carbohydrate? So in the example that I've given you here, carrots are considered to be relatively high GI. So they've got a score here, as you can see on the screen, of 68. But they have a relatively low glycemic load, and the glycemic load there is only 3, and that's because you only ever have a relatively small portion or serving of carrots. In other words, you don't sit down to a massive plate of about 2 kilos of carrots. You just have consume this carbohydrate on the side. So some dietitians suggest that the glycemic load is actually a better indicator of the effect of carbohydrate has on a person's blood glucose level. And it's essentially another ranking system that allows or at least includes this portion size. So as you can see on the screen, anything greater than 20 is considered to be a high glycemic load, 11 and 19 is medium, and less than 10 is considered to be low glycemic load. So I've given you the example here of carrots. They've got a high glycemic index, so if you only advise people on based on the glycemic index, you'd be saying, well, don't eat carrots, but because you don't eat a lot of them and you factor in the amount of the volume of that particular carbohydrate, the glycemic load is relatively small. So this slide just shows you probably what you already know, just a comparison between what are considered to be high GI and low GI foods. And if you're a proponent of or supporter of the whole low GI diet approach, then the recommendation is obviously to base meals on a high fiber carbohydrate meals that have whole grains, bread, cereals, fruits and vegetables, etc. With the theory being this, and you've probably seen this before as well, the idea is to either have 3 regular meals a day or 6 small meals a day, and the concept behind that is to try and minimize the peaks and the troughs with regard to blood glucose level. You don't want that big spike in blood glucose, nor do you want that hypoglycemic, that low blood glucose. And one way to avoid that is to supposedly eat your carbohydrates pretty regularly throughout the day. Now, I don't necessarily subscribe to that model. I think it's flawed, but that is what has been accepted in the traditional view of carbohydrates. So what about if we talk about carbohydrates in the athlete? Again, this is what we have always considered to be the traditional approach with regard to athletes and carbohydrates. Certainly, this is an argument that is supported by Sports Dietitians Australia, and that is Carbohydrates are the main fuel that all athletes they run on. They need to avoid low carbohydrate diets supposedly, and the diet should consist of low GI carbohydrate sources, as I've just covered. So, if carbohydrate is the most important macronutrient in the athlete's diet, then it is also considered to be the most important macronutrient for those involved in endurance events. Now, in most Western countries, carbohydrate contributes about 40 to 50% of the energy intake, but for physically active people, the recommendation is that it should contribute about 55 to 60% of kilojoules of total energy from carbohydrates, which is about 6 to 10 grams per kilo of body weight. And starches are the preferred source of carbohydrate, particularly unprocessed grains and fruits and vegetables. Now, we're going to spend a little bit more time on these points later in the semester, about week 8, when we look at pre and post nutrition guidelines. But what you see on the screen are the recommendations for what an athlete should be consuming in terms of carbohydrates prior to as well as during actual endurance events. Now, that all looks pretty technical, and you need to have practiced these guidelines with your particular athlete if you're advising, rather than and trying to get it right, obviously, to see how it suits the particular athlete and their event, whether there's any intestinal upset, etc., as you go along. For the last couple of points where it's got recommendations on how many grams, so between 45 and 60 minutes, if your exercise goes between 45 and 60 minutes, then you should be having less than about 30 grams of carbohydrates per hour, etc., etc. Then I've just got a couple of very basic examples there of what constitutes how many grams of carbohydrates you could supplement their diet with, particularly during exercise. There's also a bit of a scale that has been supported in the past, which is anything from light activity all the way down to heavy, with a suggestion of how many grams of carbohydrate per kilo of body weight athletes should be consuming relative to their activity level. Now, you've all heard of carbohydrate loading because it's been around for a fair while now, certainly a couple of decades. Essentially, every athlete wants to maximize their glycogen stores so that they can obviously delay the onset of fatigue. The traditional model of carbohydrate loading, which was around 20, 30 years ago, was what we call this depletion, deprivation, and loading phase, which was 2 to 3 days of intense exercise designed to deplete glycogen stores, then 2 to 3 more days of less intense exercise to keep glycogen stores low, and then the consumption of a high carbohydrate diet and the cessation of any activity in the last couple of days. So you want to maximize those carbohydrate stores. If you do that with an athlete or with a client, they're not going to like you. Why? Because the depletion and the deprivation stages are not very pleasant. So the preferred model is either 2 to 3 days of high carbohydrate loading immediately prior to an event, or essentially just a high carbohydrate all the time. Now, if you're going to go down the path of a high carbohydrate all the time, then particularly endurance athletes, the recommendation is to be as high as 70 to 80% of your daily energy intake is actually from carbohydrates. So I'll give you an example. I'll walk you through an example of a 75 kilo athlete. Let's say their carbohydrate requirements are between 525 and 750 grams per day. I've got there that you need to ensure some protein and some other nutrients. But essentially providing 700 grams of carbohydrates a day is a lot of food to get through. So here's a basic example of how you could meet around 700 grams of carbohydrates per day. And as you can see from the screen, that's a lot of eating and a lot of food. Anything from, and you can see some examples here, honey, 500 mils of orange juice, half a litre of sports drinks, some jelly babies, etc. There's examples there where there is a grab for simple carbohydrates to essentially try to get as close to the 700 plus grams of carbohydrates a day. So if you are advising a client on carbohydrate loading, depending on their event and how well they can tolerate this amount of food, as well as the carbohydrate from an intestinal perspective, one of the challenges is essentially keeping them eating to meet their needs. Now, if you have advised somebody with carbohydrate loading, they may well turn around and go, well, how do I know with my event coming up on the weekend, how do I know that I'm as loaded as I can? Well, you can pay for a muscle biopsy, but I'd advise against it because it's kind of invasive and expensive and kind of hurts. One of the simplest ways is to essentially jump on the scales, because every gram of glycogen you store on the body, it stores with it 3 grams of water. So if you've got 300 to 400 grams of glycogen stored in the body, that's 900 to 1200 grams of water, or mils of water, so you're going to have obviously a weight gain, and that's the easiest way to essentially determine how much carbohydrate you actually are carrying around.